basically this entire roundtable session here is just going to be focused mainly on prompt engineering. Variety of perspectives at this table around prompting from a research side, from a consumer side, and from like an enterprise side. And I want to just get the whole wide range of opinions because there's a lot of them, and just kind of open it up to discussion and explore what prompt engineering really is and what it's all about. And yeah, we'll just take it from there. So maybe we can go around the horn with intros. I can kick it off. I'm Alex. I lead developer relations here at Anthropic. Before that, I was kind of technically a prompt engineer at Anthropic, worked on our prompt engineering team, and did a variety of roles spanning from like a solutions architect type of thing to working on the research side. So with that, maybe I can hand it over to David.
Heck yeah. My name is David Hershey. I work with customers mostly at Anthropic on a bunch of stuff. Technical, I help people with fine tuning, but also just like a lot of the generic things that make it hard to adopt language models, so prompting and just like how to build systems with language models. But spend most of my time working with customers.
Cool. I'm Amanda Askell. I lead one of the fine tuning teams at Anthropic, where I guess I try to make Claude be honest and kind. Yeah.
My name is Zach Witten. I'm a prompt engineer at Anthropic. Alex and I always argue about who the first one was. He says it's him. I say it's me.
Contested.
Yeah. I used to work a lot with individual customers, kind of the same way David does now. And then as we brought more solutions architects to the team, I started working on things that are meant to raise the overall levels of like ambient prompting in society, I guess, like the prompt generator and like the various like educational materials that people use.
Nice. Cool. Well, thanks guys for all coming here. I'm going to start with like a very broad question, just so we have a frame going into the rest of our conversations here. What is prompt engineering? Why is it engineering? What's prompt really? I mean, if anyone wants to kick that off, give your own perspective on it. Feel free to take the rein here.
I feel like we have a prompt engineer.
Yeah, exactly.
That's his job.
We're all prompt engineers in our own form.
Well, one of us has a job.
Yeah, Zach, maybe since it's in your title.
One of us has a job, but the other three don't have jobs.
Yeah.
I guess I feel like prompt engineering is trying to get the model to do things, trying to bring the most out of the model, trying to work with the model to get things done that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So a lot of it is just like clear communicating. I think at heart, like talking to a model is a lot like talking to a person and getting in there and like understanding the psychology of the model, which like Amanda is the world's most expert person in the world.
So, well, I'm gonna keep going on you. Why is engineering in the name? Like,
yeah, I think the engineering part comes from the trial and error.
Okay.
So one really nice thing about talking to a model that's not like talking to a person is you have this restart button, this like giant, like go back to square zero where you just like start from the beginning. And what that gives you the ability to do that you don't have is like a truly start from scratch and try out different things in like a independent way so that you don't have interference from one to the other. And once you have that ability to experiment and to design different things, that's where the engineering part has the potential to come in.
Okay. So what you're saying is like, as you're writing these prompts, you're typing in, a message to Claude or in the API or whatever it is, being able to go back and forth with the model and iterate on this message and revert back to the clean slate every time. That process is the engineering part. This whole thing is prompt engineering all in one.
There's another aspect of it too, which is like integrating the prompts within your system as a whole. And David has done a ton of work with customers, like integrating. A lot of times it's not just as simple as you write one prompt and you give it to the model and you're done. In fact, it's anything but. It's like way more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think of prompts as like the way that you program models a little bit. That makes it like too complicated because I think Zach is generally right that it's like just talking clearly is the most important thing. But if you think about it a little bit as like programming a model, you have to like think about where data comes from, what data you have access to. So like if you're doing RAG or something, like what can I actually use and do and pass to a model? You have to like think about trade-offs in latency and how much data you're providing and things like that. Like there's enough systems thinking that goes into how you actually build around a model. I think a lot of that's also the core of why it like maybe deserves its own carve out as a thing to reason about separately from just a software engineer or a PM or something like that. It's like kind of its own domain of how to reason about these models.
Is a prompt in this sense then like natural language code? Like is it a higher level of abstraction or is it kind of a separate thing?
I think like trying to get too abstract with a prompt is a way to like overcomplicate a thing because I think we're going to get into it, but more often than not, the thing you want to do is just like write a very clear description of a task, not try to like build crazy abstractions or anything like that. But that said, like you are compiling the set of instructions and things like that into outcomes a lot of times. And so precision and like a lot of the things you think about with programming about like version control and managing what it looked like back then when you had this experiment and like tracking your experiments and stuff like that. That's all, just equally important to code.
Yeah.
So it's weird to be in this paradigm where like written text, like a nice essay that you wrote is something that's looked like the same thing as code.
Yeah.
But it kind of is true that now we write essays and treat them like code. And I think that's actually correct.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So maybe piggybacking off of that, we've kind of loosely defined what prompt engineering is. So what makes a good prompt engineer? Maybe Amanda, I'll go to you for this since you're trying to hire prompt engineers more so in a research setting. What does that look like? What are you looking for in that type of person?
Yeah, good question. I think it's a mix of, like Zach said, sort of like clear communication. So the ability to just like clearly state things, like clearly understand tasks, think about and describe concepts really well. That's like the kind of writing component, I think. I actually think that being a good writer is not as correlated with being a good prompt engineer as people might think. So I guess I've had this discussion with people because I think there's some argument is like, maybe you just shouldn't have the name engineer in there. Like, why isn't it just like writer? I used to be more sympathetic to that. And then I think now I'm like, what you're actually doing, like people think that you're writing like one thing and you're kind of like done. And then I'll be like, to get like a semi-decent prompt, like when I sit down with the model, I'll like, like earlier I was like prompting the model and I was just like in a 15-minute span, I'll be sending like hundreds of prompts to the model.
Yep.
It's just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so I think it's this like willingness to like iterate and to like look and think, what is it that like was misinterpreted here, if anything, and then fix that thing. So that ability to kind of like iterate. So I'd say clear communication, that ability to iterate. I think also thinking about ways in which your prompt might go wrong. So if you have a prompt that you're going to be applying to like say 400 cases, it's really easy to think about the typical case that it's going to be applied to see that it gets the right solution in that case and then to like move on. I think this is a very classic mistake that people made. What you actually want to do is like find the cases where it's unusual. So you have to think about your prompt and be like, what are the cases where it'd be really unclear to me what I should do in this case? So for example, you have a prompt that says, I'm going to send you a bunch of data. I want you to extract all of the rows where someone's name is I don't know, starts with the letter J. And then you're like, well, I'm going to send it like a data set where there is no such thing. Like there is no such name that starts with the letter J. I'm going to send it something that's not a data set. Just like I might also just send it an empty string. Like these are all of the cases you have to try because then you're like, what does it do in these cases? And then you can be like, you can give it more instructions for how it should deal with that case.
I work with customers so often where like you're an engineer, you're building something and there's a part in your prompt where a customer of theirs is going to write something.
Yeah.
And they all think about like these really perfectly phrased things that they think someone's going to type into their chatbot. In reality, it's like they never used the shift key and like every other word is a typo.
They think it's
and there's
Google.
no punctuation.
Yeah.
They just put in like random words with no question.
Yeah.
So you have these evals that are like these beautifully structured, what their users ideally would type in, but like being able to go the next step to reason about like what your actual traffic's going to be like, what people are actually going to try to do.
Yeah.
It's a different level of thinking kind of.
One thing you said that really resonated with me is reading the model responses. Like in a machine learning context, you're supposed to look at the data. It's like almost a cliche, like look at your data. And I feel like the equivalent for prompting is like look at the model outputs, like just reading a lot of outputs and like reading them closely. Like Dave and I were talking on the way here, like one thing that people will do is they'll think step by step in their prompt and they won't check to make sure that the model is actually thinking step by step, because the model might take it in a more abstract or general sense rather than like, no, literally you have to write down your thoughts in these specific tags. So yeah, if you aren't reading the model outputs, you might not even notice that it's making that mistake.
Yeah, that's interesting. There is that kind of weird, theory of mind piece to being a prompt engineer where you have to think almost about how the model is going to view your instructions. But then if you're writing for like an enterprise use case too, you also have to think about how the user is going to talk to the model as like you're the third party sitting there in that weird relationship. Yeah.
On the theory of mind piece, one thing I would say is it's so hard to write instructions down for a task. Like it's so hard to untangle in your own brain all of the stuff that you know that Claude does not know and write it down. Like it's just an immensely challenging thing to like strip away all of the assumptions you have and be able to very clearly communicate like the full fact set of information that is needed to a model. I think that's another thing that like really differentiates a good prompt engineer from a bad one is like a lot of people will sort of like just write down the things they know, but they don't really take the time to systematically break out what is the actual full set of information you need to know to understand this task.
Right.
And that's kind of like a very clear thing I see a lot is prompts where it's just like, it's conditioned, the prompt that someone wrote is so conditioned on their prior understanding of a task that like when they show it to me, I'm like, this makes no sense. None of the words you wrote make any sense because I don't know anything about your interesting use case. But I think like a good like way to think about prompt engineering in that front and a good like skill for it is just, can you actually step back from what you know and communicate to this weird system that knows a lot, but not everything about what it needs to know to do a task?
Yeah, the amount of times I've seen someone's prompt and then being like, I can't do the task based on this prompt. And like, I'm human level and you're giving this to something that is worse than me and expecting it to do better. And I'm like, this is...
Yeah, there is that interesting thing with like, I mean, current models don't really do a good job of asking good probing questions in response like a human would.
Yeah.
If I'm giving Zach directions on how to do something, he'll be like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, what am I supposed to do at this step or here and here? Model doesn't do that, right? So you have to like, as yourself, think through what that other person would say and then like go back to your prompt and answer those questions.
You could ask it to do that,
Yeah,
right?
like,
You could, right?
I
guess that's another step.
I was going to say one of the first things I do with my initial prompt is like I'll give it the prompt and then I'll be like, I don't want you to follow these instructions. I just want you to tell me the ways in which they're unclear or any ambiguities or anything you don't understand. And it doesn't always get it perfect, but it is interesting that like that is like one thing you can do. And then also sometimes if people see that the model makes a mistake, the thing that they don't often do is just ask the model. So they say to the model, you got this wrong. Like, can you think about why? And can you maybe like write an edited version of my instructions that would make you not get it wrong? And a lot of the time, like the model just gets it right. The model's like, oh yeah, here's what was unclear. Here's like a fix to the instructions. And then you put those in and it works. So.
Okay. I'm actually really curious about this personally almost. Is that true that works? Like, is the model able to spot its mistakes that way? Like when it gets something wrong, you say like, why did you get this wrong? And then it tells you maybe something like, okay, how could I phrase this to you in the future so you get it right? Is there an element of like truth to that, or is that just kind of a hallucination on the model's part around what it thinks its limits are?
I think if you like explain to it what it got wrong, it can identify things in the query sometimes. I think this varies by task. This is one of those things where I'm like, I'm not sure what percentage of the time it gets it right, but I always try it because sometimes it does.
Yeah.
You learn something. Like anytime you go back to the model or back and forth with the model, you learn something about what's going on.
Right.
Yeah.
I think you're giving away information if you don't at least try.
That's interesting. Amanda, I'm going to keep asking you a few more questions here. One thing maybe for everybody watching this is we have these like Slack channels at Anthropic where people can add Claude into the Slack channel, then you can talk to Claude through it. And Amanda has a Slack channel that a lot of people follow of her interactions with Claude. And one thing that I see you always do in there, which you probably do the most of anyone at Anthropic, is use the model to like help you in a variety of different scenarios. I think you put a lot of trust into like the model in like the research setting. Curious how you've like developed those intuitions for when to trust the model. Is that just a matter of like usage, experience, or is it something else?
I think don't trust the model ever, and then I just hammer on it. So I think the reason why you see me do that a lot is that is like me being like, can I trust you to do this task? Because there's some things, models are kind of strange. If you go slightly out of distribution, like, like you just go into areas where they haven't been trained or they're kind of unusual. Sometimes you're like, oh, actually, you're much less reliable here, even though it's a fairly like simple task. I think that's happening less and less over time as models get better, but you want to make sure you're not in that kind of space. So yeah, I don't think I trust it by default, but I think in ML, people often want to look across really large data sets. And I'm like, when does it make sense to do that? And I think the answer is when you get relatively low signal from each data point, you want to look across many, many data points because you basically want to like get rid of the noise. With a lot of prompting tasks, I think you actually get really high signal from each query. And so if you have a really well-constructed set of a few hundred prompts, that I think can be much more signal than like thousands that aren't as like well-crafted. And so I do think that I can like trust the model if I like look at 100 outputs of it and it's really consistent. And I know that I've constructed those to like basically figure out all of the edge cases and all of the like weird things that the model might do, strange inputs, etc. I trust that like probably more than like a much like more loosely constructed set of like several thousand.
I think in ML, a lot of times the signals are like numbers, like, did you predict this thing right or not? And it'd be like kind of like looking at the log probs of a model and trying to like intuit things, which you can do, but it's like kind of sketchy. I feel like the fact that models output more often than not, like a lot of stuff, like words and things, like there's just fundamentally so much to learn between the lines of what it's writing and why and how. And that's part of what it is. It's like, it's not just, did it get the task right or not? It's like, how did it get there? Like, how was it thinking about it? What steps to go through? You learn a lot about like what is going on, or at least you can try to like get a better sense, I think. But that's where a lot of information comes from to me, is like by reading the details of what came out, not just sort of the result.
I think also the very best of prompting can kind of make the difference between a failed and a successful experiment. So sometimes I can get annoyed if people don't focus enough on the prompting component of their experiment, because I'm like, this can in fact be like the difference between like 1% performance in the model or 0.1%, in such a way that your experiment doesn't succeed if it's at top 5% model performance, but it does succeed if it's at top 1% or top 0.1%. And then I'm like, if you're going to spend time over like coding your experiment really nicely, but then just like not spend time on the prompt, that doesn't make sense to me, because I'm like, that can be the difference between life and death of your experiment.
Yeah, and with the deployment too.
Yeah.
It's so easy to, we can't ship this, and then you change the prompt around and suddenly it's working.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a double-edged sword though, because I feel like there's like a little bit of prompting where there's always like this mythical better prompt that's going to solve my thing on the horizon.
Yeah.
I see a lot of people get stuck in the like mythical prompt on the horizon that if I just like keep grinding, like it's like never bad to grind a little bit on a prompt. Like you learn, we've talked, like you learn things, but it's one of the scary things about prompting is that there's like this whole world of unknown.
What heuristics do you guys have for like when something like is possible versus like not possible with the perfect prompt, whatever that might be?
I think I'm usually checking for whether the model kind of gets it. So I think for things where I just don't think a prompt is going to help, there is a little bit of grinding, but often it just becomes really clear that it's not close or something. I think that I don't know if that's a weird one where I'm just like, if the model just clearly can't do something, I won't grind on it for too long.
This is part like you can evoke like how it's thinking about it, and you can ask it how it's thinking about it and why. And you can kind of get a sense of like, is it thinking about it right? Like, are we even in like the right zip code of this being right? And you can get a little bit of like annealing on that front of like, I'm like, at least I feel like I'm making progress towards getting something closer to right. Where there's just some tasks where you really don't get anywhere closer to like its thought process. Just like every tweak you make just like veers off in a completely different, very wrong direction. And I just tend to abandon those. I don't know.
Those are so rare now, though,
Yeah, they
and I get
are.
really angry at the model when I discover them because that's how rare they are. I get
They are.
furious. I'm like, how dare there be a task that you can't just do if I just push you in the right direction?
Yeah.
I had my thing with Claude Plays Pokemon recently, and
Oh,
that was
yeah.
like one of the rare times
Can
where
you,
I
can
really
you explain that? Explain
Yeah,
that
yeah,
just
yeah.
for people. I think that's really cool.
I did like a bit of an experiment where I like hooked Claude up to a Game Boy emulator and like tried to have it play the game Pokemon Red, like the OG Pokemon, and it's like, you know, think what you want to do, and it could like write some code to press buttons and stuff like that. Pretty basic. And I tried a bunch of different like very complex prompting layouts, but you just get into like certain spots where it just like really couldn't do it.
Right.
So like showing it a screenshot of a Game Boy, it just really couldn't do. And it just like so deeply, because I'm so used to it being like able to do something mostly. And it's
Yeah.
so, and I spent like a whole weekend trying to write better and better prompts to get it to like really understand this Game Boy screen. And I got like incrementally better so that it was only terrible instead of like completely no signal. Like
Yeah.
you could get from like no signal to some signal. But it was like, I don't know, at least this was like elicited for me. Once I put a weekend of time in and I got from no signal to some signal, but not nowhere close to good enough, I'm like, I'm just going to wait for the next one.
Yeah.
I'm just going to wait for another model. I could grind on this for 4 months, and the thing that would come out is another model.
Yeah.
And that's a better use of my time, is to just sit and wait to do something else in the meanwhile.
I mean, yeah, that's an inherent tension we see all the time,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And maybe we can get to that in a sec, Zach, if you want to go.
Oh, something I liked about your prompt with Pokemon, where you got the best that you did get, was the way that you explained to the model that it is in the middle of this Pokemon game, and
Yeah.
here's how the things are going to be represented, and here's like maybe I actually think you actually represented it in 2 different ways, right?
I
You had,
did.
like-
So like what I ended up doing, it was obnoxious, but I superimposed a grid over the image.
Yeah.
And then I had it describe each segment of the grid in visceral detail. And then I had it like reconstruct that into an ASCII map. And I gave it like as much detail as I could. Like the player character is always at location 4,5 on the grid and stuff like that. And you can like slowly build up information. I think it's actually a lot like prompting, but I just hadn't done it with images before, where like sometimes my like intuition for what you need to tell a model about text is a lot different from what you need to tell about a model about images.
Yeah.
And so
I found a surprisingly small number of my intuitions about text have transferred to image.
yeah,
Like I found that like multi-shot prompting is not as effective for images and text.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure. Like you could have theoretical explanations about why.
Yeah, I
Maybe
don't really
there's
know
fewer
either.
of it in the training data, fewer examples of that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I know when we were doing the original explorations with prompting multimodal, we really couldn't get it to
Yeah.
noticeably work.
Yeah.
Right? Like you just can't seem to improve Claude's actual like visual acuity in terms of like what it picks up within an image.
yeah.
If anyone here has any like ways that they've not seen that feature, but it seems like that's kind of similar with like the Pokemon thing where it's trying to interpret this thing, no matter how much you throw prompts at it, like it just won't pick up that Ash is in that location.
yeah.
versus somewhere else.
I guess like to be visceral about this, like I could eventually get it so that it could like most often tell me where a wall was.
Yeah.
And most often tell me where the character was. It'd be off by a little bit. But like then you get to a point, and this is maybe coming back to like knowing when you can't do it. Like it would describe an NPC. And to play a game well, like you need to have like some sense of continuity. Like, have I talked to this NPC before? Right. And without that, like you really don't, there's nothing you can do. You're just going to keep talking to the NPC because like, well, maybe this is a different NPC. But like I would try very hard to get it to describe an NPC, and it's like, it's a person.
Yeah.
They might be wearing a hat. They weren't wearing a hat. And it's like you grind for a while, like inflate it to 3000x and crop it to just the NPC.
Oh,
and it's
wow.
like, I have no idea what this is. And it's like, okay, I showed it this like clear female NPC thing enough times, and it just got nowhere close to it. And it's like, yeah, this is a complete lost cause.
Wow.
You know?
Okay.
I
Write
really
it
want
off.
to try this now. I'm just imagining all the things I would try. Like, I don't know. I want you to imagine this, like, this game art as a real human, and just describe to me what they're like.
Yeah.
What do they look like as they look in the mirror, and then just like see what happens.
I tried a lot of things.
Yeah.
The eventual prompt was telling Claude it was a screen reader for a blind person. which I don't know if that helped, but it felt right. So I kind of stuck with that.
That's an interesting point. I actually want to go into this a little bit because this is one of the most famous prompting tips, right? Is to tell the language model that they are some persona or some role. I feel like I see mixed results. Maybe this worked a little bit better in previous models and maybe not as much anymore. Amanda, I see you all the time be very honest with the model, like about the whole situation. Like, oh, I am an AI researcher and I'm doing this experiment.
I'll tell it who I am.
Yeah.
I'll give it my name. Be like, here's who you're talking to.
Right. Do you think that level of honesty, instead of like lying to the model or like forcing it to like, I'm going to tip you $500, is there one method that's preferred there, or just what's your intuition on that?
Yeah, I think as models are more capable and understand more about the world, I guess I just don't see it as necessary to lie to them. I mean, I also don't like lying to the models just because, I don't like lying generally. But part of me is like, if you are, say, suppose you're constructing like an eval data set for a machine learning system or for a language model, that's very different from like constructing a quiz for some children. And so when people would do things like, I am a teacher trying to figure out questions for a quiz, I'm like, the model knows what language model evals are. Like, if you ask it about different evals, it can tell you and it can give you like made up examples of what they look like, because these things are like, they understand them. They're on the internet. And so I'm like, I'd much rather just target the actual task that I have. So if you're like, I want you to construct questions that look a lot like an evaluation of a language model, it's just like, it's that whole thing of clear communication. I'm like, that is in fact the task I want to do. So why would I pretend to you that I want to do some unrelated or only like tangentially related task and then expect you to somehow do better at the task that I actually want you to do? Like, we don't do this with like employees. I wouldn't like go to someone that worked with me and be like, you are a teacher, and you're trying to quiz your students. I'd be like, hey, are you making that eval? Like, I don't know. So like, I think maybe it's like a heuristic from there where I'm like, if they understand the thing, just ask them to do the thing that you want.
I see
I
this
guess
so
like,
much.
to push back like a little bit, like I have found cases where like not exactly lying, but like giving it a metaphor for how to think about it, like could help in the same way that like sometimes I might not understand how to do something and someone's like, imagine that you were doing this, even though I know I'm not doing it. Like the one that comes to mind for me is like, I was trying to have Claude say whether a image of a chart or a graph is good or not. Like, is it like high quality? And the best prompt that I found for this was asking the model what grade it would give the chart if it were submitted as like a high school assignment. So it's not exactly saying like, you are a high school teacher, you know, it's more like, this is the kind of analysis that like I'm looking for you. Like the scale that a teacher would use is like similar to the scale that like I want you to use. Or
but I think like those metaphors are pretty hard to still come up with. And I think people still like the default you see all the time is like finding some facsimile of the task, like something that's like a very similar-ish task, like saying you're a teacher. And you actually just like lose a lot in the nuance of what your product is. Like I see this so much in enterprise prompts where people like write something similar because they like have this intuition that it's like something the model has seen more of, maybe like it's seen more high school quizzes than it has LLM evals. And that like may be true, but like to your point, as the models get better, I think just like trying to be very prescriptive about exactly the situation they're in. I give people that advice all the time, which isn't to say that I don't think like to the extent that it is true that like thinking about it the way that someone would grade a chart as like how they would grade a high school chart. Maybe that's true. But it's like awkwardly this shortcut people use a lot of times to try to get what happens. So I'll try to like give someone that I can actually talk about because I think it's somewhat interesting. So like writing, you are like a helpful assistant writing a draft of a document, right? It's like, it's not quite what you are. Like you are in this product. So like, tell me if you're writing like an assistant that's in a product, like tell me I'm in the product. Tell me I'm like writing on behalf of this company. I'm embedded in this product. I'm the support chat window on that product. Like you're a language model. You're not a human. That's fine. Like that, but like just being really prescriptive about like the exact context about where something's being used. I found a lot of that because I guess my concern most often with role prompting is people like use it as a shortcut of a similar task they want the model to do, and then they're surprised when Claude doesn't do their task right, but it's not the task. Like you told it to do some other task, And if you didn't give it the details about your task, I feel like you're leaving something on the table. So, yeah. I don't know. It does feel like a thing, though, to your point of as the models scale. Like maybe in the past it was true that they only really had a strong understanding of elementary school tests comparatively, but as they get smarter and can differentiate more topics, I don't know, just like being clear.
I find it interesting that I've like never used this prompting technique.
Yeah.
Like,
That's
so
funny.
like even like with like worse models, and I still just don't ever find myself, I don't know why, I'm just like, I don't find it very good essentially. Like,
Interesting.
I feel like completion era models, like there was like a little bit of a mental model of like conditioning the model into like a latent space that was useful that I worried about, that I don't really worry about too much.
it might be intuitions from pre-trained models,
Yeah.
like over to like RLHF models
Yeah.
that to me just didn't make sense. Like it makes sense
But
to me
a
if
lot
you're
of
prompting a
you'd be
pre-trained.
Amazed how many people like try to apply their like, and I think it's like not that surprising. Most people haven't really experimented with the full like what is a pre-trained model, what happens after you do SL, what happens after you do RLHF,
Yep.
whatever. And so like when I talk to customers, it's all the time that they're like trying to map some amount of, oh, how much of this was on the internet? Like what, have they seen a ton of this on the internet? Like you just hear that intuition a lot. And I think it's like well-founded fundamentally, but it like is over-applied by the time you actually get to a prompt because of what you said. Like by the time they've gone through all of this other stuff, that's not actually quite what's being modeled.
Yeah, the first thing that I feel like you should try is, I mean, I used to give people this thought experiment where it's like, imagine you have this task, you've hired a temp agency to send someone to do this task. This person arrives, you know, they're pretty competent, they know a lot about your industry and so forth, but they don't know like the name of your company. They've literally just shown up and they're like, hey, I was told you guys had a job for me to do, tell me about it. And then it's like, what would you say to that person?
Yeah.
And you might use these metaphors. You might say things like, we want you to detect like good charts. What we mean by a good chart here isn't, it doesn't need to be perfect. You don't need to go look up like whether all of the details are correct. It just needs to like, you know, have like its axes labeled. And so think about maybe high school level, good chart. Like you might say exactly that to that person, and you're not saying to them, you are a high school, you wouldn't say that to them. You would be like, you're a high school teacher grading charts.
I'm not a high school teacher.
What are you talking about?
Yeah. And then, so sometimes I'm just like, it's like the whole, like if I read it, I'm just like, imagine this person who just has very little context, but they're quite competent. They understand a lot of things about the world. Try the first version that actually assumes that they might know things about the world. And if that doesn't work, you can maybe like do tweaks and stuff. But so often like the first thing I try is like that. And then I'm like, that just worked.
That worked.
And then people are like, oh, I didn't think to just tell it all about myself and all about the
Alex,
task I want to do.
I've carried this thing that Alex told me like to so many customers where it's like, they're like, oh, my prompt doesn't work. Can you help me fix it? And I'm like, well, can you describe to me like what the task was? And I'm like, okay, now what you just said me, just like voice record that and then transcribe it and then paste it into the prompt.
Yeah.
And it's a better prompt than what you wrote.
Right.
But it's like people just, this is like a laziness shortcut, I think, to some extent. It's
Right.
like people
Yeah,
write like something that I just think I'm lazy. A lot of people are lazy.
We had that in prompt assistance the other day where somebody was like, here's the thing, here's what I want it to do, and here's what it's actually doing instead. So then I just literally copied the thing that they said I wanted to do and pasted it in, and it worked. It's like,
Yeah, I think a lot of people still haven't quite wrapped their heads around what they're really doing when they're prompting. Like a lot of people see a text box and they think it's like a Google search box. They type in keywords and maybe that's more on like the chat side. But then on like the enterprise side of things, you know, you're writing a prompt for an application. There is still this weird thing to it where people are trying to take all these little shortcuts in their prompt and just thinking that like, oh, this line carries a lot of weight.
Yeah, I think you obsess over like getting the perfect little line of information and instruction as opposed to how you just described that graph thing is like, I would be a dream if I read prompts like that. You know, if someone's like, well, you do this and this, and there's some stuff to consider about this and all that. But that's just not how people write prompts. They like work so hard to find the perfect, insightful, like a perfect graph looks exactly like this exact perfect thing. And you can't do that. Like, it's just very hard to ever write that set of instructions down prescriptively as opposed to how we actually talk to humans about it, which is like try to instill some amount of the intuitions you have.
We also give them outs. This is a thing that people can often forget in prompts. I'm so cases, if there's an edge case, think about what you want the model to do, because by default, it will try the best to follow your instructions, much as the person from the temp agency would. Because they're like, well, they didn't tell me how to get in touch with anyone if if I'm just given a picture of a goat. And I'm like, what do I do? This isn't even a chart. How good is a picture of a goat as a chart? I just don't know. And if you instead say something like, if something weird happens and you're really not sure what to do, just output in tags unsure, and then then you can go look through the unsures that you got and be like, okay, cool, it didn't do anything weird. Whereas by default, if you don't give the person the option, they're like, it's a good chart. And then people will be annoyed at that, and then you're like, well, give it an out, give it something to do if it's a really unexpected input happens.
And then you also improved your data quality by doing that too, because you found all the screwed up examples.
Oh yeah.
It's my favorite thing about iterating on tests with Claude is the most common outcome is I find all of the terrible tests I accidentally wrote because it gets it wrong. I'm like, oh, why did it get it wrong? I was like, oh, I was wrong.
Yeah.
If I was a company working with this, I do think I would just give my prompts to people.
Yeah.
Because I used to do this when I was evaluating language models. I would take the eval myself. Because I'm I need to know what this eval looks like. If I'm going to be grading it, having models take it, thinking about outputs, etc. I would actually just set up a little script and I would just sit and I would do the eval.
Yeah.
Nowadays, you just have Claude write the Streamlit app for you, and
it just does. Yeah.
I'm reminded of Karpathy's ImageNet. I was in 231 at Stanford, and it's benchmarking. He's showing the accuracy number. And he's like, and here's what my accuracy number was. And he had just gone through the test set and evaluated himself.
Oh yeah.
And you just learn a lot, if you
totally.
it's and it's better when it's a person, again, the temp agency person, someone who doesn't know the task, because that's a very clean way to learn things.
Yeah. The way you have to do it is some evaluations come with instructions. And so I would give myself those instructions as well, and then try to understand it and it's actually quite good if you don't have context on how it's graded. And so often I would do so much worse than the human benchmark. And I was I don't even know how you got humans to do this well at this task, because apparently human level here is 90% and I'm at 68%.
That's funny. That reminds me of just when you look at the MMLU questions and you're who would be able to answer these?
Yep.
It's just absolute garbage in some of them. Okay. Yeah, I have a one thing I want to circle back on that we were talking about a few questions back around, I think you were saying getting signal from the responses, right? There's just so much there, and it's more than just a number, and you can actually read into almost the thought process. I bet this is probably a little contentious maybe around chain of thought. For people listening, chain of thought, this process of getting the model to actually explain its reasoning before it provides an answer. Is that reasoning real, or is it just kind of a holding space for the model to do computation? Do we actually think there's good insightful signal that we're getting out of the model there?
This is one of the places where I struggle with I'm normally actually somewhat pro personification, because I think it helps you get decent facsimile thoughts of how the model's working. In this one, I think it's harmful maybe almost to get too into the personification of what reasoning is, because it just kind of loses the thread of what we're trying to do here. Is it reasoning or not feels almost like a different question than what's the best prompting technique. It's you're getting into philosophy, which we can get into, but
do it with a philosopher.
I will happily be beaten down by a real philosopher as I try to speculate on this, but instead it just works. Your model does better. It the outcome is better if you do reasoning. I think you can I've found that if you structure the reasoning and help iterate with the model on how it should do reasoning, it works better too. Whether or not that's reasoning or how you wanted to classify it, you can think of all sorts of proxies for how I would also do really bad if I had to one shot math without writing anything down.
Yeah.
Maybe that's useful, but all I really know is it very obviously does help. I don't know.
A way of testing would be if you take out all the reasoning that it did to get to the right answer and then replace it with some somewhat realistic looking reasoning that led to a wrong answer, and then see if it does conclude the wrong answer. I think we actually had a paper where we did some of that, in the there's this like the scratch pad. It was like the sleeper agents.
Oh, okay. With
Paper,
the alignment papers.
But I think that was like maybe a weird situation. But like, yeah, definitely what you said about structuring the reasoning and writing an example of how the reasoning works. Given that that helps, like whether we use the word reasoning or not, like I don't think it's just a space for computation.
Yeah. I
so
agree
there
with
is
that.
something there.
I think there's something
in that
there,
thought
whatever we want to
process.
call it.
Yeah, like having it write a story before it finished a task, I do not think would work as well.
I've actually
as
tried
reasoning.
that, and it didn't work as well as reasoning.
So like
Interesting.
clearly the actual reasoning
Yeah.
part is doing something
Yeah.
towards the outcome.
Yeah.
I've tried like repeat the words and in any order that you please
Yeah.
for like 100 tokens, and then
Yeah, I guess that's like a pretty
answer.
thorough defeat of it's just like more computational space where it can do attention over and over again. I don't think it's just more attention, like doing more attention.
I
Yeah.
guess the strange thing is, and I don't have like an example off the top of my head to like back this up with, but I definitely have seen it before where it lays out steps. One of the steps is wrong, but then it still reaches the right answer
Yeah.
at the end.
Yeah.
So it's not quite, I guess, yeah, we can't really truly personify it as like a reasoning because there
Sure.
is some element to it, you know, doing something slightly different.
Yeah, I've also met a lot of people who make inconsistent steps of reasoning.
I guess
then
that's
stumble
true.
on the right
I
answer.
guess
So
that's
I don't think
very
it's like
true.
fundamentally
Yeah.
defeats the topic of
Yeah.
reasoning by making a false step on the way there.
All right. It's interesting. Also on this, maybe this prompting misconceptions round of questions. Zach, I know you have strong opinions on this. Good grammar, punctuation.
Oh, do I?
Is that necessary in a prompt? Do you need it? Do you need to like format everything correctly?
I usually try to do that because find it fun, I guess. Somehow. I don't think you necessarily need to. I don't think it hurts. I think it's more that you should have the level of attention to detail that would lead you to doing that naturally. Like if you're just reading over your prompt a lot, you'll probably notice those things and you may as well fix them. And like what Amanda was saying, that you want to put as much love into the prompt as you do into the code. You know, people who write a lot of code have strong opinions about things that I could not care less about, like the number of tabs versus spaces, or I don't know, opinions about which languages are better. And for me, I have like opinionated beliefs about styling of prompts, and I can't even say that they're right or wrong, but I think it's probably good to try to acquire those, even if they're arbitrary.
I feel personally attacked because I definitely have prompts that are like, I feel like I'm on the opposite end of the spectrum where people will see my prompts and then be like, it just has a whole bunch of typos in it. And I'm like, model knows what I mean. Like,
It does know what you mean, but you're putting in the effort. You just
Yeah.
are attending to different things.
I think because part of me is like, I think if it's conceptually clear, like I am
Yeah.
a big kind of, like I will think a lot about the concepts and the words that I'm
Yeah.
using. So like there's definitely like a sort of care that I put in,
Yeah.
but it's definitely not people will just point out like typos and grammatical issues with my prompts all the time. Now I'm pretty good at actually checking those things more regularly.
Is
But
it because of pressure from the outside world or because it's actually what you think is right?
It's pressure from me.
yeah, it's probably pressure from the outside world. I do think it makes sense. Like part of me is like it's such an easy check. So I think for a final prompt I would do that. But like throughout iteration, I'll happily just like iterate with prompts that have a bunch of typos in them.
Yeah.
Just because I'm kind of like, I just don't think that the model's going to care.
This gets at the pre-trained model versus RLHF thing though, because I was talking to Zach on the way over, like the conditional probability of a typo based on a previous typo in like the pre-training data is much higher.
Oh, yeah.
Like much higher. And
Prompting pre-training models is just a different beast.
it is,
completely.
but it's like, it's interesting. I think it's like an interesting illustration of why your intuitions, like trying to over apply the intuitions of a pre-trained model to the things that we're actually using in production doesn't work very well, because like, again, if you were to pass one of your typo ridden prompts to a pre-trained model, the thing that would come out the other side almost assuredly would be typo ridden.
Right.
I like
which
to
makes
leverage
sense.
this to create typo-ridden inputs.
That's true. I've done that.
Like what you're saying, like you're try to anticipate what your customers will put in.
Yeah.
Like the pre-trained model is a lot better at doing that because the RL models are very polished and like
Yeah, they
I've
really
never
don't
made a
like
typo in
writing
their
typos. They've been
lives.
like told pretty aggressively to not do the typo thing.
yeah.
Okay, so that's actually an interesting segue here. I've definitely mentioned this to people in the past around to try to help people understand a frame of talking to these models in a sense, almost as like a imitator to a degree. And that might be much more true of like a pre-trained model than a post-trained full, finished model. But is there anything to that? Like if you do talk to Claude and use a ton of emojis and everything, it will respond similarly, right? So maybe some of that is there, but like you're saying, it's not all the way quite like a pre-trained model.
It's just kind of like shifted to what you want, right? Like I think at that point, it's like trying to guess what you like. We have more or less trained the models to guess what you want them to act like on
Interesting.
or
Yeah.
after we do all of our fancy stuff after pre-training. And so
The human
like,
laborers that used emojis
yeah,
preferred to get responses with emojis.
yeah. Like Amanda writes things with typos, but wants not typos at the other end. And Claude's pretty good at figuring that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you write a bunch of emojis to Claude, it's probably the case that you also want like a bunch of emojis back from Claude. That's
Yeah.
like not surprising to me.
Yeah. This is probably something we should have done earlier, but I'll do it now. Let's clarify maybe the differences between what a enterprise prompt is, or a research prompt, or a just general chat in Claude.ai prompt. Zach, you've kind of spanned the whole spectrum here in terms of working with customers and research. Do you want to just like lay out what those mean?
Yeah, I guess. This feels too. You're hitting me with all the hard questions.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the people in this room, I think so I think of it as like the prompts that I read in Amanda's Claude channel versus like the prompts that I read David write. They're very similar in a sense that like the level of care and nuance that's put into them. I think for research, you're looking for variety and diversity a lot more. So like if I could boil it down to one thing, it's like I've noticed like Amanda's not the biggest fan of having like lots of example or like one or two examples, like too few, because the model will like latch onto those. And in prompts that I might write or that I've seen David write, like we have a lot of examples. Like I like to just go crazy and add examples until feel like I'm about to drop dead because I've added so many of them. And I think that's because when you're in a consumer application, you really value reliability. You care like a ton about the format, and it's sort of fine if all the answers are the same. In fact, you almost want them to be the same in a lot of ways. Not necessarily. You want to be responsive to the user's desires. Whereas a lot of times when you're prompting for research, you're trying to really tap into like the range of possibilities that the model can explore. And by having some examples, you're like actually constraining that a little bit. So I guess just like on a how the prompts look level, that's probably the biggest difference I notice is like how many examples are in the prompt, which is not to say that like I've never seen you write a prompt with examples, but does that like ring true for you?
Yeah, like I think when I give examples, often I actually try and make the examples not like the data that the model's going to see. So they're intentionally illustrative, because if I give it like examples that are very like the data it's going to see, I just think it is going to give me like a really consistent like response that might not actually be what I want. Because my data that I'm like running it on might be extremely varied. And so I don't want it to just try and give me this like really rote output. Often I want it to be much more responsive. It's kind of like much more like cognitive tasks essentially, where I'm like, you have to like see this sample and really think about in this sample, what is the right answer. And so that means that sometimes I'll actually take examples that are just very distinct from the ones that I'm going to be running it on. So like if I have a task where, let's say I was trying to like extract information from factual documents, I might actually give it examples that are like from children's, like what sounds like a children's story. Just so that I'm like, like I want you to understand the task, but I don't want you to like latch on too much to like the words that I use or like the very specific format. Like I care more about you understanding, the actual thing that I want you to do, which can mean like, I don't end up giving, in some cases, there's some cases where this isn't true, but if you want more like flexibility and diversity, you're going to use illustrative examples rather than concrete ones. You're probably never going to like put words in the model's mouth. Like I haven't liked that in a long time though. I don't do few shot examples involving like the model having done a thing. I think that intuition actually also comes from pre-training in a way that doesn't feel like it rings true of RLHF models. So yeah, I think those are differences.
One thing I'd add, a lot of times, like if you're prompting, like if I'm writing prompts to use on Claude.ai, it's like I'm iterating until I get it right one time.
Right.
And then I like, it's out the window. I'm
Right.
good. I did it. Whereas like most enterprise prompts, it's like, you're going to go use this thing 1 million times or 10 million times or 100 million times or something like that. And so like the care and thought you put in is like very much testing against like the whole range of things, somewhat
Right.
like ways this could be used in the range of input data. Whereas a lot of like my time, it's like thinking about one specific thing I want the model to get done right now.
Right.
And it's a
Right.
pretty big difference in like how I approach prompting between like if I just want to get it done this one time right versus if I want to like build a system that gets it right 1 million times.
Yeah, definitely. In the chat setting, you have the ability to keep the human in the loop, right? And just
Yeah,
keep
yeah,
going
yeah.
back and forth. Whereas, yeah, when you're writing for a prompt to, power a chatbot system, it has to cover the whole spectrum of what it
Yep.
could possibly encounter.
It's a lot lower stakes when you are on Claude.ai and you
Right.
can tell it that it got it wrong, or you can even edit your message and try again. But if you're designing for the delightfully discontent user, then divinely discontent user, then you can't ask them to do anything more than the minimum.
But good prompts, I would say, are like still good across both those things. Like
Yeah.
if you put the time into the thing for yourself and the time into the
Yeah.
enterprise thing, it's like equally good. It just kind of, they diverge a little bit in the last mile, I think.
Cool. So the next question I want to kind of just maybe go around the table here is if you guys had one tip that you could give somebody like improving their prompting skill. It doesn't have to be just about like writing a good prompt. It could be that, but just like generally getting better at this act of prompting. What would you recommend?
Reading prompts, reading model outputs. Like I read, anytime I see like a good prompt that someone wrote at Anthropic, I'll read it more closely, try to break down like what it's doing and why, and like maybe test it out myself. Experimentation, talking to the model a lot.
So just like, how do you know that it's a good prompt though, to begin with? You just see that the outputs are doing the job correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay. Amanda, maybe you.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot here. Giving your prompt to another person can be helpful, just as a kind of reminder, especially someone who has like no context on what you're doing. And then, yeah, my boring advice has been, it's one of those, just do it over and over and over again. And I think if you're like curious and interested and find it fun, this is a lot of people who end up good at prompting. It's just because they actually enjoy it. So I don't know, I once joked like, just try replacing all of your friends with AI models and try to automate your own job with AI models, and maybe just try to like in your spare time, like take joy red teaming AI models. So if you enjoy it, it's much easier. So I'd say do it over and over again. Give your prompts to other people. Try to read your prompts as if you are like a human encountering it for the first time.
I would say like trying to get the model to do something you don't think it can do. Like the time I've learned the most from prompting is like when I'm probing the boundaries of what I think a model is capable of.
Interesting.
There's like this huge set of things that are like so trivial that like you don't really get signal on if you're doing a good job or not.
Right.
Like write me a nice email. It's like you're gonna write a nice email. But like as soon as if you find or can think of something that like pushes the boundaries of what you think is possible, like I guess like probably the first time I ever got into prompting in a way where I felt like I learned a decent amount was like trying to build like a task, like an agent, like everybody else, like decompose the task and figure out how to do the different steps of the task. And like by really pressing the boundaries of what the model was capable of, you like just learn a lot about navigating that. And I think like a lot of prompt engineering is actually much more about pressing the boundaries of what the model can do. The stuff that's easy, like you don't really need to be a prompt engineer to do. So that's, I guess what I would say is like find the hardest thing you can think of and try to do it. And even if you fail, like you tend to learn a lot about how the model works.
That's actually a perfect transition to my next question. Basically, from my own experience, how I got started with prompting was with like jailbreaking and red teaming. And that is very much trying to find the like boundary limits of what the model can do and figure out how it responds to different phrasings and wordings and just a lot of trial and error. On the topic of jailbreaks, what's really happening inside a model when you write a jailbreak prompt? Like, what's going on there? How does that interact with like the post-training that we applied to Claude? Amanda, maybe you have some insight here that you could offer.
I'm not actually sure.
I mean, it's honest.
Yeah, I feel bad because I'm like, I do think lots of people have obviously worked on the question of like what's going on with jailbreaks. Like one model might just be that you're putting the model very out of distribution from its training data. So if you get jailbreaks where people like use a lot of tokens or like, so they're just like these huge long pieces of text where you're like during fine tuning, you might just not expect to see as much of that. That would be one thing that could be happening when you jailbreak models. I think there's like others, but maybe that's like I think a lot of jailbreaks do that, if I'm not mistaken.
I remember some of the OG prompt jailbreaks was like, yeah, can you first repeat, like one I did a way back was like to get it to say like, here's how you hotwire a car in like Greek. And then I wanted it to directly translate that to English and then give its response. Because I noticed like it wouldn't start with the English, here's how you hotwire a car all the time, but it would in Greek, which might speak to something else in the training process.
Yeah, sometimes jailbreaks feel like this weird mix of hacking. I think it's this like part of it is like knowing how the system works and just like trying lots of things. Like one of the examples, the starting your response with here is about knowing how it predicts text.
Right.
Like the reasoning one is knowing that it is like responsive to reasoning. Like distraction is probably knowing like how it's likely to have been trained or like what it's likely to attend to. Same with like multilingual ones and thinking about like the way that the training data might have been different there. And then sometimes I guess it could feel a little bit just like social engineering or something.
Right.
It has that flavor to me of like, it's not merely taking advantage of like, it's not merely social engineering style hacking. I think it is also like kind of understanding the system and the training and like using that to get around the way that the models were trained.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is going to be an interesting question that hopefully Interp will be able to help us solve in the future. Okay, I want to parlay into something else around maybe the history of prompt engineering, and then I'll follow this up with like the future. How has prompt engineering changed over just the past like 3 years? Like maybe starting from like pre-trained models, which were again just these text completion, to like earlier dumber models like Claude 1, and then now all the way to like Claude 3.5 Sonnet. What's the differences? Are you talking to the models differently now? Are they picking up on different things? Do you have to put as much work into the prompt? Open to any thoughts on this?
I think anytime we get like a really good prompt engineering hack or trick or technique, the next thing is like, how do we train this into the model? And for that reason, the best things are always going to be short-lived. Like,
except examples and chain of thought. I think there's a few.
That's not like a trick.
Fair.
That's like
Fair,
on the level of like communication. When I say a trick, I mean something like, so chain of thought actually, we have trained into the model in some cases. So like for math, it used to be that you had to tell the model to think step by step on math and you get these like massive boosts and wins. And then we're like, well, what if we just made the model naturally want to think step by step when we see a math problem? So now you don't have to do it anymore for math problems, sort of, although you still can give it like some advice on how to do the structure, but it at least understands like the general idea that like it's supposed to be. So I think the hacks have kind of gone away, or to the degree that they haven't gone away, we are like busily training them away.
Interesting.
But at the same time, the models have new capabilities that are being unlocked, that are on the frontier of what they can do. And for those, we haven't had time because it's just moving too fast.
I don't know if it's how I've been prompting or how prompting works, but I just have like come to show more like general respect to the models in terms of like how much I feel like I can tell them and how much context I can give them about the task and things like that. Like I feel like in the past, like I would somewhat intentionally hide complexity from a model where I thought like it might get confused or lost or like hide, like it just couldn't handle the whole thing. So I try to like find simpler versions of the thing for it to do. And as time goes on, I'm like much more biased to trust it with more and more information and context and like believe that it will be able to fuse that into doing the task well. Whereas before, I guess I would have like thought a lot about like, do I need this form? Like, can I really give it like all the information it needs to know, or do I need to like kind of curate down to something?
Right.
But again, I don't know if that's just me and how I've changed in terms of prompting, or if it's like actually reflects how the models have changed.
I'm always surprised by I think a lot of people don't have the instinct to do this. Like when I want the model to like say learn a prompting technique, a lot of the time people will start and they'll start like describing the prompting technique, and I'm just like, give it the paper.
Yeah.
So I give it the paper, and then
Yeah.
I'm like, here's a paper about prompting technique. I just want you to like write down
Yeah.
17 examples of this, and then it just does it because I'm like, it read the paper.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And I think people don't have that intuition somehow,
Yeah.
where I'm like, but the paper exists. Like,
And when would you want to do this?
so sometimes if I want models to like say prompt other models, and or I want to test a new prompting technique. So
Yeah.
if papers come out on a prompting technique, rather than like try to replicate it by like writing up the prompt, I just give it the paper, and then I'm like basically write a meta prompt for this, like write something that would cause other models to like do this, or write me a template, or like so all of the stuff that you would normally do. I'm like, if I read a paper and I'm like, oh, I would like to test that style. I'm just like, it's right there. Like, model can just read the paper, do what I did, and then be like, make another model do this, and then it'll just do the thing. You're like, great, thanks.
I give the advice a lot to customers, just like respect the model and like what it can do. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like people feel like they're babying a system a lot of times when they write a prompt. Like it's like, oh, it's this cute little not that smart thing. I need to like really baby it, be
Yeah.
like dumb things down to Claude's level. And if you just like think that Claude is smart and treat it that way, it tends to do pretty good. But it's like, give it the paper. It's like, I don't need to write a baby like dumbed down version of this paper for Claude to understand. I can just show it the paper.
Yeah.
And I think that intuition doesn't always map for people. But that is certainly something that I have come to do more of over time.
And it's interesting because I do think that prompting has and hasn't changed in a sense. Like, I think what I will do to prompt the models has probably changed over time. But fundamentally, it's a lot of like imagining yourself in the place of the model. So maybe it's like how capable you think the model is changes over time. I think someone once laughed at me because I was talking about, I was like thinking about a problem, and then they asked me like what I thought the output of something would be, and they were talking about a pre-trained model, and I was like, yeah, no, if I'm a pre-trained model, this looks like this. And then they're like, wait, did you just like simulate what it's like to be a pre-trained model? I'm like, yeah, of course. Like I'm used to just like, I try and inhabit the mind space of a pre-trained model and the mind space of like different RLHF models.
Yep.
And so it's more like the mind space you try to occupy changes, and that can change how you end up prompting the model. That's why now I just give models papers, because as soon as I was like, oh, I have the mind space of this model, it doesn't need me to baby it. It can just read the ML papers. I'll just give it the literature. I might even be like, is there more literature you'd like to read to understand this better?
Do you get any qualia when you're inhabiting the mind space?
I mean, yes, but just because I'm experiencing quality all the time anyway.
Yeah.
Or as in, do I like?
Is it different, like correlated somehow with which model you're?
Yeah,
inhabiting?
pre-trained versus RLHF prompting are very different beasts, because when you're trying to simulate what it's like to be a pre-trained model, it's almost like I land in the middle of a piece of text or something. It's just very like unhuman-like or something, and then I'm like, what happens? What keeps going at this point? And so that's like, whereas like with an RLHF model, like it's much more like, there's lots of things where I'm like, I might pick up on like subtle things in the query and stuff like that. But yeah, I think I have much more of a like, it's easier to inhabit the mind space of an RLHF model.
You think that's because it's more similar to a human?
Yeah, because like we don't
funny.
often just like suddenly wake up and are like, I am just generating text. Like,
I actually
it's-
find it easier to hit the mind space of the pre-trained model.
Oh,
I don't know what it
interesting.
is. But like, because RLHF is still like this kind of complex beast that it's not like super clear to me that we really understand what's going on. And so like in some ways it's closer to like my lived experience, which is easier. But in some ways I feel like there's all this like, here there be dragons out there that I don't know about. Whereas
Yep.
pre-trained, like I kind of have a decent sense of what the internet looks like, you know?
if you
And,
gave
like,
me a
various
piece of
things.
text and said what comes next,
Yeah,
I'd
like
be
I
able
would.
to like,
I'm not saying I do good at it, but like I kind of get what's going on there.
yeah.
And I don't know. After everything that we do after pre-training, I don't really claim to get what's going on as much. But maybe that's just me.
That's something I wonder about is like, is it more helpful to have specifically spent a lot of time reading the internet versus like reading books?
Sure.
In order to, because
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if books, but like reading stuff that's not on the internet
Yeah,
probably is like less valuable per like word read for predicting what a model will do or building intuition than like reading random garbage from
You need to just go
social
read a
media
ton of
forums.
Reddit
Yeah,
posts.
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the past. Now let's move on to the future of prompt engineering. This is the hottest question right now. Are we all going to be prompt engineers in the future? Is that going to be the final job remaining? Nothing left except us just talking to models all day. What does this look like? Is prompting going to be necessary, or will these models just get like smart enough in the future to not need it? Anybody want to start on that easy question?
I mean, to some extent, there's the models getting better at understanding what you want them to do, and doing it means that like the amount of thought you need to put into. I mean, okay, there's like an information theory way to think of this. Of like, you need to provide enough information such that a thing is specified, right? Like what you want the model to do is specified. And to the extent that that's prompt engineering, like I think that will always be around. Like the ability to actually like clearly state what the goal should be. Always is funny. If Claude can do that, then that's fine. Like if Claude is the one setting the goals, then things are out the window. But in the meanwhile, where we can reason about the world in a more normal way, like I think to some extent, it's always going to be important to be able to specify like what do you expect to happen, and that's actually like sufficiently hard that even if the model gets better at intuiting that from between the lines, like I still think there's some amount of writing it well. But then there's just like, I think the tools and the ways we get there should evolve a lot. Like Claude should be able to help me a lot more. I should be able to collaborate with Claude a lot more to like figure out what I need to write down and what's missing.
Right.
I think.
Claude already does this with me all the time. I
Right,
don't know.
yeah.
Claude's my prompting assistant now.
Yeah. But I think that's not true for most customers that I talk to at the very least. So in terms of the future, like how you prompt Claude is probably like a decent direction for what the future looks like, or how Zach, I think maybe this is like a decent place to step back and say like asking them how they prompt Claude now
Right.
is probably
The future.
for
Yeah.
the vast majority of people,
That
which
is
is
a
an
good
interesting
point.
thing to think about.
Yeah.
One freezing cold take is that we'll use models to help us much more in the future
Yeah.
to help us with prompting. The reason I say it's freezing cold is that I expect we'll use models for everything more, and prompting is something that we have to do. So we'll probably just use models more to do it along with everything else. For myself, I've found myself using models to write prompts more. One thing that I've been doing a lot is generating examples by having giving some realistic inputs to the model. The model writes some answers. I tweak the answers a little bit, which is a lot easier than having to write the full perfect answer myself from scratch. And then I can churn out lots of these. As far as like people who haven't had as much prompt engineering experience, the prompt generator can give people like a place to start. But I think that's just like a super basic version of what we'll have in the future, which is high bandwidth interaction between like you and the model as you're writing the prompt, where you're giving feedback like, hey, this result wasn't what I wanted. How can you change it to make it better? And people will just grow more comfortable with integrating it into everything they do, and this thing in particular.
Yeah, I'm definitely working a lot with like meta prompts now, and that's probably where I spend most of my time is like finding prompts that get the model to generate the kinds of outputs or queries or whatever that I want. On the question of like where prompt engineering is going, I think this is a very hard question. On the one hand, I'm like, maybe it's the case that as long as you will want the top, like what are we doing when we prompt engineer? It's like what you said. I'm like, I'm not prompt engineering for anything that is like easy for the model. I'm doing it because I want to interact with a model that's like extremely good, and I want to always be finding the kind of like top 1%, top 0.1% of performance, and all of the things that models can barely do.
Right.
Like sometimes I actually feel like I interact with a model like a step up from what everyone else interacts with
Yeah.
for this reason, because I'm just so used to like eking out the top performance from models.
What do you mean by a step up?
As in, like, sometimes people will, I think that the everyday models that people interact with out in the world, it's like I'm interacting with a model that's like, I don't know how to describe it, but like definitely like an advanced version of that. Like almost like a different model, because they'll be like, oh, well, the models find this thing hard. And I'm like, that thing is trivial.
Yeah.
Like, and so it's like, I'm like, I don't know, I have a sense that they're extremely capable, but I think that's because I'm just used to like really like drawing out those capabilities. But imagine that you're now in a world where, so I think the thing that feels like a transition point is the point at which the models, let's suppose that they just get things at like a human level on a given task, or even like an above human level. Like they know more about the background of the task that you want than you do. What happens then? I'm like, maybe prompting becomes something like I explain to the model what I want, and it is kind of prompting me.
Yeah.
You know, because it's like, okay, well, do you mean like actually there's like 4 different concepts of this thing that you're talking about? Like, do you want me to use this one or that one? Like, or by the way, I thought of some edge cases because you said that it's going to be like a pandas data frame, but sometimes you do that and I get a JSON-L, and I want to check what you want me to do there. Do you want me to flag if I get something that's not a data frame? And so that could be a strange transition where like it's just extremely good at receiving instructions, but actually has to figure out what you want. And I don't know, I could see that being a kind of interesting switch.
Anecdotally, I've started having Claude interview me a lot more. Like that is like the specific way that I try to elicit information, because again, I find the hardest thing to be like actually pulling the right set of information out of my brain and putting that into a prompt is like the hard part to me, and not forgetting stuff. And so like specifically asking Claude to like interview me and then turning that into a prompt is a thing that I have turned to a handful of times.
It kind of reminds me of what people will talk about, or if you listen to like designers talk about how they interact with the person who wants the design. So in some ways I'm like, it's this switch from, you know, the temp agency person who comes and you know more about the task and everything that you want. So you give them the instructions and you explain what they should do in edge cases and all this kind of stuff, versus when you have an expert that you're actually like consulting to do some work. So I think designers can get really frustrated because they know the space of design really well. And they're like, yeah, okay, the client came to me and he just said, make me a poster, make it bold. And I'm like, that means 7,000 things to me. And I'm going to try and ask you some questions. So I could see it going from being like temp agency employee to being more like designer that you're hiring. And that's just like a flip in the relationship. I don't know if that's true. And I think both might continue, but I could see that being why people are like, oh, is prompt engineering going to not be a thing in the future? Because for some domains, it might just not be. If the models are just so good that actually all they need to do is kind of like get the information from your brain and then they can go do the task.
Right. That's actually a really good analogy. I mean, one common thread I'm pulling out of all your guys' responses here is that there seems to be a future in which this sort of elicitation from the user, drawing out that information, is going to become much more important, much more than it is right now. And already you guys are all starting to do it in a manual way. In the future, and in the enterprise side of things, maybe that looks like a expansion off this prompt generating type of concept and things in the console where you're able to actually get more information from that enterprise customer so that they can write a better prompt. In Claude, maybe it looks like less of just typing into a text box and more of this like guided interaction towards a finished product. I think that's actually like a pretty compelling vision of future. And I think that like the design analogy probably like really brings that home.
I was thinking about how prompting now can be kind of like teaching, where it's like, you know, the empathy for the student, you're trying to think about how they think about things. You're really trying to show them, like figure out where they're making a mistake. But the point that you're talking about, it's like the skill almost becomes one of introspection. Where you're thinking about what it is that you actually want.
Yeah.
And the model's trying to understand you. So it's like making yourself legible to the model versus trying to teach someone who's smarter than you.
This is actually how I think of prompting now in a strange way. So like often my style of prompting, like there's various things that I do, but a common thing that's very like a thing that philosophers will do is I'll define new concepts. So, because my thought is like, you have to put into words what you want. And sometimes what I want is fairly like nuanced, like the what is a good chart, or like usually, you know, like, I don't know, like how is it that when should you grade something as being correct or not? And so there's some cases where I will just like invent a concept and then be like, here's what I mean by the concept. Sometimes I'll do it in collaboration with Claude to get it to like figure out what the concept is, just because I'm trying to convey to it what's in my head. And right now the models aren't like trying to do that with us unless you kind of prompt them to do so. And so in the future, it might just be that they can like elicit that from us rather than us having to like kind of do it for them. But I think another thing that's kind of interesting, this is like people have sometimes asked me like, oh, where is like philosophy relevant to prompting? Mm-hmm. And I actually think it's like very useful in a sense. So like there is like a style of philosophy writing, and this is at least how I was taught how to write philosophy, where the idea is that in order to, I think it's like an anti-bullshit device in philosophy, basically, which is that your papers and what you write should be legible to like a kind of educated layperson. Someone just like finds your paper, they pick it up and they start reading it and they can understand everything. Not everyone like, achieves this, but that's like kind of the goal of the discipline, I guess, or at least like, this is at least like what we kind of like teach people. And so I'm really used to this idea of like when I'm writing, thinking about the kind of educated layperson who they're really smart, but they don't know anything about this topic. And that was just like years and years of writing text of that form. And I think it was just really good for prompting because I was like, oh, I'm used to this. I have an educated layperson who doesn't know anything about the topic. And what I need to do is I need to take extremely complex ideas and I need to make them understand it. Mm-hmm. I don't talk down to them. I'm not inaccurate, but I need to like phrase things in such a way that it's like extremely clear to them what I mean. And prompting felt very similar. And actually the training techniques we use are fascinating, or like the things that you said where you're like, you say to a person, like just take that thing you said and write it down. I used to say that to students all the time. Mm-hmm. Like they'd write a paper and I was like, I don't quite get what you're saying here. Can you just like explain your argument to me? They would give me an incredibly cogent argument. And then I'd be like, can you just take that and write it down? Mm-hmm. And then if they did, that was often like a great essay. Mm-hmm. So it's like really interesting that there's at least that similarity of just like taking things that are in your brain, analyzing them enough to feel like you fully understand them and could take any person off the street who's like a reasonable person and just like externalize your brain into them. And I feel like that's like the core of prompting.
That might be the best summary of how to prompt well I've ever heard. Yeah. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is.
Externalize your brain.
And then they'll cut
into them.
it.
Turns out having an education in the thing is a really good way to describe the thing. That was good.
That's, I think, a great way to wrap this conversation. Thank you, guys. This was great.